This is not the first time this year a meteorologist has stood in front of a camera and used almost this exact language. In May, it was a highly unusual storm pattern steered by an upper-level trough behaving nothing like the typical spring setup, an early and easily overlooked signal at the time. Later that same month, it was cold air digging unusually far south and rare snowflakes threatening the northeast at the tail end of spring. In June, it was a rolling, severe threat meteorologist Max Schuster said nobody was ready for, a warning that proved accurate as the danger continued shifting from state to state faster than most residents could track. In July, Schuster called the pattern, developing at that point, one of the strangest he had seen in that specific month in quite some time. And now, in August, the same meteorologist is describing something strange about to grip the entire country, mixing heat, cold, wildfire smoke, flooding, and repeated severe storm chances into a single, scattered, hard-to-track week that arrives as the clearest, most complex escalation of everything the year has already shown. 6 separate moments, 5 months. The same word, strange, showing up again and again from experienced forecasters who do not use that language casually. Weather coverage typically treats each new severe weather warning as its own isolated story, disconnected from whatever came before it earlier in the season. That approach makes sense when covering a single storm's arrival and departure, but it misses something important when the same descriptive language keeps resurfacing month after month, potentially from the same forecaster tracking the same broader atmosphere. Stepping back far enough to actually see that repeated pattern requires deliberately connecting dots that most day-to-day weather coverage never bothers to draw together, exactly the exercise this video is built around. Today, we are going to walk through this entire pattern of warnings, explain what actually connects them, and why the current installment is being described as the most dangerous version yet. If tracking real weather patterns as they actually develop over an entire season, not just a single alarming week, is something you want to keep doing, subscribing means you catch the next update the moment new information comes in. Let's start by walking through this year's actual sequence of warnings, because seeing them laid out together reveals something a single week's forecast never could. Back in May, meteorologist Max Schuster described the country moving into one of the stranger patterns he had seen in some time, with storm systems being steered around a large upper-level trough instead of following the more familiar route out of the Rockies and into the plains. That trough-dominated setup did not produce one clean, obvious, severe weather outbreak, Schuster explained at the time, but instead delivered several smaller, trickier events, active, odd, and somewhat unpredictable in his own words. Understanding why a trough-steered pattern behaves so differently from a typical spring setup helps explain why forecasters flagged it as unusual from the very start. In a more conventional spring pattern, storm systems tend to organize and move along a relatively predictable path out of the Rockies and across the plains, giving forecasters a reasonably consistent structure to track from one system to the next. A large, upper-level trough, sitting in an unusual position instead, steers those same storm systems around its own circulation, scattering their tracks in less predictable directions, and making it considerably harder to forecast exactly which specific communities would face the greatest severe weather risk on any given day. At the same time, ridging attempting to build into the Great Plains added a second layer of complexity, occasionally suppressing severe weather in some areas while shifting that same risk toward others, leaving the entire country in what Schuster described as an active, odd, and somewhat unpredictable stretch, well before summer had even properly begun. Only weeks later, the pattern shifted again, and Schuster was describing something different but equally unusual: cold air pushing, unexpectedly far south, storms forming around unusual edges, and the possibility of rare snowflakes reaching the northeast at a point in the calendar when that kind of cold has no business showing up at all. He described the stretch ahead as very interesting, a phrase forecasters tend to use when a pattern is producing genuine surprises rather than confirming the outcome they originally expected. By late June, the language shifted from unusual toward genuinely alarming. Schuster warned of a very strange, severe threat, describing a rolling pattern in which one region would face storms before the danger. Move to the next area entirely, capable of producing repeated rounds of damaging winds, large hail, isolated tornadoes, and a few more focused tornado setups through an extended stretch of days. He specifically noted how difficult that kind of week is for people to actually follow, since the greatest danger keeps relocating, and a quiet day in one specific city offers no real assurance that the broader pattern has calmed down anywhere else. That same rolling, hard-to-track structure would go on to define nearly every subsequent warning through the rest of the summer. The specific June setup Schuster described that week illustrated this rolling structure with real precision, a marginal, severe weather area stretching from central Wyoming all the way down to Jackson, Mississippi, combined with a separate concern centered on southern Wisconsin and northern Illinois, two genuinely distant regions facing meaningfully different versions of the same broader threat within the same forecast period. Damaging winds were expected to be the primary hazard across many of these locations, but the sheer geographic spread involved, stretching across roughly a third of the country's width in a single outlook, was exactly the kind of scattered coverage that made the pattern so difficult for residents in any single location to fully track without checking updates far more frequently than a more geographically contained severe weather event would typically require. July brought the most direct acknowledgement yet that something genuinely unusual was underway. Describing a developing storm system capable of bringing severe weather from the northern plains through the Midwest, Ohio Valley, Mid-Atlantic, and into parts of the Northeast, Shuster stated plainly that this specific weather pattern would be one of the strangest patterns the country had seen in July in quite some time. That same forecast described an environment combining severe storms, unusually strong winds aloft, heavy rain, a brief spike of heat, and then a sudden, sharp cool down, with some areas potentially waking up to temperatures in the upper 40s or low 50s by the following weekend. A genuinely startling contrast to the brutal heat gripping other parts of the country at the very same time. Shuster was explicit that this was not simply one storm moving across the map, it was a broader rearrangement of the entire national weather pattern. The temperature swing deserves particular attention, since a drop into the upper 40s or low 50s during the middle of July represents a genuinely dramatic departure from typical midsummer conditions across the affected region, the kind of reading more commonly associated with an unusually cool September morning than the height of summer. Experiencing that kind of cold snap in the same general window as brutal heat gripping other parts of the country simultaneously is precisely the sort of internal contradiction that makes a pattern like this one so difficult. To summarize in a single forecast headline, since no single word hot or cold actually captures what different regions were experiencing at the very same moment under the same broader atmospheric rearrangement. Now, in August, the same underlying character has returned and by most accounts escalated. The current pattern, according to Shuster's most recent forecast, brings an unusual mix of intense heat, cooler air, wildfire smoke, flooding concerns, and repeated chances for severe thunderstorms, all within the same stretch of days. A disturbance emerging from the Rockies drags a powerful cold front into the northern plains and Midwest, capable of producing damaging winds, large hail, and possibly an isolated tornado. Later in the week, a heat dome, expanding eastward from the west, supplies fresh energy for an entirely new round of storms across the central and eastern states, even as that same heat and dryness continues worsening wildfire conditions across the region, already struggling with drought. Multiple hazards unfolding simultaneously, shifting geographically day by day, exactly the same structural signature that has defined nearly every one of this year's strange pattern warnings, just arriving now with wildfire smoke and flood risk stacked directly on top of the more familiar severe storm threat. What makes this specific August installment feel like a genuine escalation rather than simply another entry in the same recurring theme is the sheer number of distinct hazard categories now converging at once. Earlier warnings this year tended to emphasize one or two dominant themes at a time. An unusual storm track in May, a surprising cold intrusion in late May, a rolling severe threat in June, a heat and cold whiplash in July. This August pattern instead layers together heat, cold, wildfire smoke, flooding, and severe storms. Within the same rough window, drawing on nearly every individual element the year has already demonstrated, the atmosphere is capable of producing, rather than featuring just one or two of those elements in relative isolation, the way most of the previous warnings did. Here's what actually connects all 6 of these warnings together, and it is worth understanding clearly because it explains why this specific year has produced so many of them rather than the more typical handful a normal year might generate. Every one of these patterns traces back to the same broader phenomenon, an unusually large and unusually persistent reservoir of heat and moisture available to the atmosphere this year, driven by ocean temperatures running measurably above their seasonal average across large stretches of the Pacific, the Gulf of Mexico, and the broader Atlantic basin. That oversized energy supply does not simply make individual storms stronger, it increases the odds that the broader jet stream pattern steering weather across the entire country behaves less predictably, producing exactly the kind of trough-driven detours, rolling multi-region threats, and sudden temperature swings that Shuster has been describing in slightly different forms since May. This connects directly to a much larger climate signal that has been building throughout the year alongside these individual weather warnings. A rapidly strengthening El Niño, now trending toward what could become one of the strongest such events ever recorded. El Niño reshapes global atmospheric circulation by warming the tropical Pacific and altering where and how the jet stream flows across the entire globe. And 2026's version of that event is developing on top of an already record-warm global ocean baseline, a genuinely unprecedented combination according to climate scientists tracking it closely. That underlying signal does not explain every single detail of every individual strange pattern warning issued this year. Weather remains genuinely complex and locally variable, even within a broader climate trend. But it provides a coherent, physically grounded explanation for why an entire season's worth of independent forecasts, issued months apart by the same meteorologist, kept landing on the same basic conclusion. This year's atmosphere is behaving less predictably than a typical year, and doing so consistently enough that the word strange kept becoming the most accurate way to describe it. It is worth being precise about the direction of that relationship, since El Niño itself was still in its earlier developmental stages back in May, well before it reached the strength it carries now, heading into fall. That timeline actually strengthens rather than weakens the connection, since it means this year's pattern of strange, unpredictable weather began showing up in forecaster language even before the El Niño signal driving it had fully matured, consistent with how a developing climate pattern typically influences the atmosphere gradually and unevenly as it strengthens, rather than switching on abruptly at a single identifiable moment. The steady escalation from May's oddly steered storms to August's full multi-hazard convergence tracks reasonably well against the steady strengthening of the underlying El Niño signal over that same stretch of months, exactly the kind of gradual buildup climate scientists would expect to see, reflected in increasingly unusual regional weather patterns as a major event like this one continues to develop. It is worth pausing on why a single meteorologist repeatedly reaching for the same descriptive language across an entire season is itself meaningful evidence, separate from the underlying science explaining why it might be happening. Forecasters build their professional judgment through years of comparing each new setup against a mental library of historical analogs, previous patterns they have tracked and watched play out. When a forecaster's own internal comparison keeps coming back unusual, month after month, across genuinely different types of weather setups, upper-level troughs in May, cold intrusions in late May, rolling severe outbreaks in June, a multi-hazard rearrangement in July, and now a scattered heat-cold-smoke storm combination in August, that consistency reflects something more than a single forecaster's changing mood or communication style. It reflects a genuine, repeated pattern of the atmosphere failing to match historical expectations, observed independently across 5 separate months by someone whose entire profession depends on recognizing exactly that kind of deviation. Consider what the alternative explanation would actually require to be true. If Schuster's repeated use of the word strange across 5 separate months reflected nothing more than a personal stylistic habit rather than genuine meteorological deviation, that pattern would have to show up regardless of what the atmosphere was actually doing, appearing just as often during genuinely ordinary weeks as during genuinely unusual ones. Instead, each instance of that language was tied to a specific, technically described departure from typical seasonal behavior, an upper-level trough steering storms along an atypical path, cold air intruding far outside its normal seasonal range, a rolling severe threat spanning an unusually wide geographic area, a summer heat to cold swing spanning tens of degrees within days, and now a multi-hazard convergence combining smoke, storms, heat, and flooding simultaneously. Each specific technical justification differs, but the consistent presence of a genuine, describable meteorological anomaly behind every single instance is exactly what separates a real, repeated pattern from mere habitual language. The current August installment carries additional weight specifically because of how it combines nearly every element from the previous 5 warnings into a single week. May's trough-driven unpredictability shows up in this week's difficulty, pinning down exactly where the greatest danger will land on any given day. Late May's unusual temperature extremes reappear in this week's simultaneous heat dome and cooler pockets. June's rolling, region-hopping severe threat structure defines how this week's storm chances are expected to shift geographically day by day. July's combination of genuinely different hazard types arriving together, rather than one at a time, returns in this week's mix of severe storms, heat, and now wildfire smoke layered directly on top of everything else. This is not simply the 6th entry in a list of separate strange weeks. It functions as something closer to a culmination, drawing together nearly every unusual element the year has already produced, into one especially complex, especially dangerous stretch. That culmination framing matters for how seriously this specific week deserves to be taken relative to the 5 warnings that preceded it. Each earlier installment this year, however unusual in its own right, generally centered on 1 or 2 dominant themes that residents in the affected region could focus their preparation around. This week offers no such simplicity. A resident trying to prepare has to simultaneously account for the possibility of severe thunderstorms, extreme heat, hazardous wildfire smoke, and flash flooding, all within the same short window. A genuinely more demanding preparedness challenge than anything the year's 5 previous strange pattern warnings required on their own. Given this entire season-long context, here is what is actually worth doing differently than you might during a typical, more isolated, severe weather warning. Treat this week's pattern as part of an ongoing seasonal trend rather than an isolated event, meaning the underlying conditions driving it are unlikely to fully resolve once this specific week passes, and continued vigilance through the remainder of the season is genuinely warranted rather than optional. Follow your local National Weather Service office directly, rather than relying solely on a single national forecast source, since a pattern this scattered generates constantly shifting regional priorities that a broad national overview cannot always capture in real time. That local first approach matters more this year specifically than it might during a more typical season, precisely because this year's pattern has repeatedly demonstrated a tendency to shift its most serious threat from region to region faster than national coverage can always keep pace with. A national broadcast covering this week's pattern has to choose which specific developments to give limited airtime, inevitably leaving some regional stories thinner than residents in that specific area might need. Local National Weather Service offices, by contrast, remain singularly focused on their own coverage area for the entire duration of a pattern like this one, issuing updates specifically calibrated to what that particular region needs to know, exactly the kind of consistent, geographically focused source this year's repeatedly scattered patterns have made more valuable than usual. Maintain broad, multi-hazard emergency supplies, rather than preparing narrowly for a single threat type, given how consistently this year's patterns have combined heat, storms, smoke, and sudden temperature swings within the same short windows. And pay attention, going forward specifically, to how forecasters describe upcoming patterns, since the language experienced meteorologists choose, strange, unusual, highly changeable, has functioned as a genuinely reliable early signal throughout this particular year for exactly the kind of complex, multi-hazard week now unfolding. Treat that kind of language as a genuine practical cue rather than background noise the next time you encounter it, whether from Schuster specifically or any other experienced meteorologist covering your own region. A forecaster reaching for unusual, rather than routine, seasonal languages, effectively telling you that their own professional pattern recognition, built from years of comparing new setups against historical analogs, has flagged something worth extra attention. This year has demonstrated, across 6 separate instances now, that this specific kind of language has reliably preceded genuinely complex, multi-hazard weather rather than simply describing an ordinary week in more dramatic terms, exactly the kind of track record that makes it worth taking seriously going forward. What connects a trough-steered May, a cold late May snap, a rolling June outbreak, a rearranged July, and this scattered, dangerous August pattern is not coincidence. It is the ground-level, week-by-week, experience of a much larger, slower-moving climate signal that has been building throughout the entire year. 6 times now, an experienced meteorologist has looked at the data and reached for the same word. And 6 times, that word has turned out to describe a genuinely atypical stretch of national weather rather than an exaggeration. That track record is really the entire point of walking through this year's warnings together, rather than treating this week's forecast as an isolated event. A single instance of unusual weather language could reasonably be dismissed as one forecaster's individual style, or one particular week's genuine but ultimately unremarkable anomaly. 6 instances, spread across 5 months, each tied to a distinct and technically justified meteorological departure from seasonal norms, and each escalating in complexity as the year has progressed, form something considerably harder to dismiss. A genuine, trackable seasonal trend, rather than a string of unrelated coincidences that happen to share the same descriptive word. The current pattern is being described as the most dangerous version yet, not because any single ingredient is unprecedented on its own, but because it draws together nearly everything the year has already demonstrated the atmosphere is currently capable of producing at once. We will keep tracking this pattern and the broader seasonal trend behind it as new forecasts come in throughout the rest of the year, watching specifically for whether the same escalating structure that carried this year from May's odd trough through August's full convergence continues building even further as fall approaches. If you want those updates the moment they land, subscribing is the way to make sure you do not miss them. And if you remember any of this year's earlier strange pattern warnings affecting your own area, tell us in the comments what that specific week was actually like where you live, because tracing how this pattern has evolved across an entire season through the actual experiences of the people living through it tells a far more complete story than any single week's forecast ever could on its own, and your own memory of exactly how strange a specific week actually felt is worth more than any single statistic in reconstructing how this year genuinely compared to the ones before it. Stay safe, and we will see you in the next one.